Man, you guys are always a talkative bunch. This is the hardest part of my job, I'll be honest here. Trying to get, it's great. It's great because you guys actually like each other, so I guess I shouldn't be so hard on you. It's kind of nice. So again, we're grateful to be in God's house today. Again, we are so thankful for our veterans and what they did for our country. They answered the call, and we are forever grateful. Again, it's an amazing time when someone's baptized. There's a lot of electricity. I mean, you just love it, right? There's just those times in the life of a faith community that's just awesome. And again, I missed last week, but Rob, I listened to the sermon. I thought it was an amazing sermon on redemption. So if you didn't hear that, go to our Facebook page, and it's on there, and you can listen to that as well. So this morning, let me ask you a question. So have you ever looked, I don't know, maybe on Facebook or Instagram now, or just looked into the life of somebody and said, I wish I had their life? Anybody? I mean, now, of course, we've talked about this with Instagram and Facebook. We see everybody's lives, right? So maybe it's the person that has, 5,000 friends. And it seems like they're going every place. Like you kind of have a boring social life, and they're everywhere, man. You see them eating, you see them going places, you see them with large groups of friends. And you make the statement, I wish I had their life, right? Or maybe it's the perfect family. You see it, you see the mom that seems like she has it all together, and you're a mom, and you're just like, man, I wish I had that. And sometimes it's even someone that's another Christ follower that we look and we go, they just seem to have a big impact. I wish I could live their life. Well, can I tell you that what you're seeing, well, a lot of times, especially on Facebook and Instagram, isn't completely true, right? However, but what you see when you see somebody's life and you think everything's going wrong, maybe that it is, you're seeing that particular chapter of their life. And maybe it's a good chapter for them, right? There are times in my life that people could look at and go, wow, man, that guy may have it all. Everything's going well, and this guy may have it all together. That would be a good chapter of my life. And then there's other times you would look at where I'm at, and you'd be maybe not so much. But I mean, it's always a glimpse in time. It's always a chapter. The problem is we're just seeing the current chapter. We don't see maybe what that person has gone through last month. We don't see the trials and the tribulations. Maybe their life is going well now. That's the chapter you're seeing. But there were a lot of other things months and years before that maybe got them to the point that they're looking at. And the sacrifice and all of those things that they had to overcome. Maybe the insecurities. And so this morning, we're going to be in the book of Ruth. Again, if you've never read the book of Ruth, I highly recommend it. 4 chapters, like 85 verses. And it's an amazing little book, and we've pointed out a lot of little things. We've talked about dating, we've talked about boundaries. We pulled a lot of things out of this particular book. But this morning, we're going to talk a lot about the providence of God, and we're going to go into that. We're also going to talk about the choices that we make, which leads us to, if we can put it on our title this morning, is Choosing Your Next Chapter. You can actually choose the next chapter of your life. And so the first thing I want to point out is our main thought for this morning, if we could get that, and it's the decisions that you make today will determine the story that you tell tomorrow. So the decisions that you make today, and I love that, right? And we always tell our kids that, but it's the same for us. The decisions that you and I make today determine the story that you tell tomorrow. So it's the people that you hang out with or don't hang out with. It's the things you do or don't do on a daily basis that's going to determine the story that you're going to tell tomorrow. And don't you think it's so true? I think the older you get especially, you see that, man. You see those times in your life where you made some bad decisions and where the story went, and now you're like, okay, so as long as you're breathing, right, God's still writing that story. That's the beauty of all of it, right? And maybe you've made a lot of mistakes and you're in a chapter of your life you don't necessarily like. But guess what? God hasn't ended your story. He's still writing that, which means the choices that you're making now determine the story that you're going to tell later on when people look at your life and go, wow, right? And so we're going to look at the book of Ruth, and we're going to find a few things about that. But let's recap a little bit. So if you remember, Ruth was a Moabite, and the Moabites, if you look back, they were despised by God. In fact, Psalms calls them, that God calls them my wash basin. And if you go in further, you find out there was some incest involved in those folks. And so God told the Jewish people to not associate with them at all. So anyhow, Ruth marries a Jewish guy in a family. And so the head of the family made a decision to move his family to Jerusalem. That's where Ruth hooks up with their son. And so the three men in the family die. Even Ruth's husband, he dies. And so Ruth makes this critical decision, I think it's in chapter 2, that she tells Naomi, who is her mother-in-law, that I'm going to forsake everything in Moab and I'm going to come and follow you. And she makes a statement, your people are my people, and she says, your God will be my God. So Ruth makes this decision in chapter 2. So again, she moves, she forsakes everything that she knew in Moab, right? And she goes and she follows Naomi to a land she didn't know and started worshiping God she didn't know. And everything worked happy ever after. Is that how it's been? No, right? So she gets in, and so she's a poor widow. She doesn't have a lot of money. And so, instead of, back in that day we talked about that a lot of times the widows were forced into prostitution to pay bills. But Ruth wasn't like that. She was a hard worker. She had character. It said she was of noble character. And so she started gleaning. And we found out that gleaning, as harvest is now done, gleaning was something where the farmers would do the harvest, and anything left, the poor people could come and they could take with them for food to feed themselves. Which is an amazing thing for me. As you know, I run a homeless shelter in Decatur and social services, and that God always had a plan to feed the poor. It's even back in the Old Testament. And so Ruth was gleaning. She just happened to stop and glean in the field of a man named Boaz. And we found out that Boaz was a God-fearing man that had this relationship with God. He was outstanding character. He was fairly wealthy. And so they started kind of hitting this little thing off. This is where we got into the dating portion. They had this dinner, and everything seemed to be going well. They're clicking on all cylinders. Everything's going great. Sparks are even flying. How many's been there? How many of you glad you're not there as far as the dating part? Hopefully sparks are still flying, right? Right? If you're married. And so you guys missed a really good chance for amen there. So anyway, I lost my train of thought about that. So, and so everything's going on, but a period of time, and Boaz, he ghosts Ruth. There's nothing. He doesn't hear anything, and she's wondering, I don't know, maybe you guys have been there at some point when you've dated. Was I too forceful? What did I do wrong? Because it seemed like we had all of these things. We're both God-fearing, and all of the qualities and everything was good. And then the mother-in-law, Naomi, got involved. I was waiting for that. I was trying to be nice because some of you are mother-in-laws. The mother-in-law gets involved, and she says, you know what? Sometimes men are hard-headed. Amen. Thank you, ladies. I was giving you a chance, too. So sometimes men are hard-headed, and she said, I have a plan that I think just might work. And so we found out in Scripture that Boaz was by the harvest, which is what they did, and he was sitting there taking a nap and sleeping. And so the plan was from Naomi, the mother-in-law, that Ruth would go over and lay at his feet and uncover his feet. How many of you think that's a good plan? That's the best she came up with. Let's really get his attention, because apparently, he's kind of hard-headed. He's a man, he doesn't get it. And so let's let him know what your affections are. And so she does that. She uncovers his feet, and of course his feet are cold, because nothing's worse at night than your feet getting cold, right? And so he looks, and she's laying there at his feet. And so that's pretty much, where we had left off. We find out that Boaz wanted to be Ruth had wanted him to be her kinsman redeemer. And if you remember, that's a concept in the Old Testament, that when a widow died, the next closest relative in the family would marry her and take care of her. That was how widows were taken care of. And again, aren't you amazed that even in the Old Testament, God had a plan? And that's what we're going to see throughout Ruth and throughout this morning, is that you got to be strategic, right? And so he finds out that, and then Boaz wants to be the kinsman redeemer. And I think the last time I was here, we left this thing hanging that he finds out he's not the closest. Which means he doesn't really have the complete right to marry her, because there's somebody else out there that has more of a claim to being her kinsman redeemer than he did. And so we're going to talk about 3 things this morning that Boaz needed in order for him to make this thing happen. He wanted that relationship with Ruth. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to be her kinsman redeemer. But there's 3 things that he had to have, which are the 3 things that you and I need in our life to write a better chapter of our lives. And the first one is he needed the providence of God. The providence of God, and again, I have a definition for you. The providence of God is whenever God uses natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural will. So one of the things you find out about the book of Ruth is that there's no miracles in there. So a lot of times, in fact, it's one of, I think, 2 or 3 books where there's no mention of like a supernatural miracle. So, God parted the Red Sea. The disciples, they had lots of healings and supernatural things. The book of Ruth is short, but it has none of those things. What it has is the providence of God, that God breaks into normally just regular circumstances and to bring about his supernatural will. You don't see. So if we're going to look this morning at Ruth chapter 4, I forget to tell you that. We are in Ruth chapter 4. You can follow along on the screen or in your Bibles. Chapter 1 says, "Meanwhile Boaz went up to the town gate, and he sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, 'Come over here, my friend, and sit down.' So he went over and sat down." So he's at the town gate. So the town gate would have been what I would say now a coffee shop, or in a small community like this, the cafe. A lot of business deals are done there. I can tell you a lot of things are done in coffee shops. Number one, because I'm there most of my time, Aaron. And also, it is people, that's just where you go. And so this was a place that everybody went like for business deals. And so they're going to negotiate this deal. They would close on land type of transactions. So again, the providence of God. So Boaz is going, I know there's somebody out there. I imagine he's praying, God, I just need to know who this is, and I need to have a meeting with him. So again, Boaz is at this particular spot, and guess who just happened to come by? The kinsman redeemer. The closest living relative to Ruth that could come along and say that I want to go through with this transaction. That's the providence of God. Has that ever happened to you guys? That I don't know, you want something to happen, you're praying, and it just so happens. Some people would say coincidence. I'll be honest, I follow Jesus enough to know there are not any coincidences. Here's what I call them: divine appointments. I believe there's those times that there's just divine appointments, that God has you in an appointed time and an appointed place for someone to speak into your life or for you to speak into their life. That's the way he works. There are no good luck if you're following Jesus. Oh yeah, well this just happened to be like, no. God had this in mind the whole time. And that's what's going on here with this. So interestingly, if you read the account, there's no name of this potential kinsman redeemer. They don't mention it. So Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. And so Samuel, there is no recognition. Why that is, we don't know. Right? We could read into it. Maybe he didn't think it was important to tell the account. But there is no name. So we're just going to call him Mr. No Name. For lack of a better word. Now I wrote this down because I think this is very important, and I want to read it because. So if you want to see the providential power of God, it's best when you look where you are and look backwards to see how God used natural circumstances that you didn't realize to bring about his supernatural will. So it's best when you look at where you're at and then you go back. Right? Because then you see where you're at is because of some things that God did back here. Quick story for me. So back in the day, which was a really long time ago, almost when Milliken was founded, I went to college there, but I know in my heart that was not probably where God wanted me to go. He was calling me to something different. I didn't go there. Right? I really felt like I was supposed to have gone to ORU, honestly. We know the story. The reason I didn't, and I can blame Crystal's not here. Dawn, you always tell her everything I say, though. So I got to blame Crystal. We were dating in high school, and I'm like, I thought of being that far away from your high school sweetheart was just too much. So, okay, God, I know maybe this is what you're wanting, but come on, right? And so I went to Milliken, and I don't know, it honestly, things didn't go well for me. It was kind of like Ruth. It was this chapter after chapter of brokenness and just things not going well. So a number of years later, I find myself at a church in Decatur called New Beginnings, and we started planting churches there. So again, I'm a Milliken alum. And so in the process of planting churches, we went to the Dominican. We were going to plant a church. There was some land that was there. So I had hooked up with a person that I had known, and he's like, hey, you need to hook up with a Milliken professor. He's over management. They take a class of Milliken students to the Dominican for a business project. Well, it just so happened at the time that I had this idea, and if you know me, I have lots and lots of ideas, about building an internet cafe in the middle of this woods, because for some sustainability and whatnot. And so he said, that'd be great for the Milliken class to do that. So I sat down with the Milliken professor, and his first thing is, you're a pastor, what are you doing here? But then I said, I'm a Milliken alum. Once you find out, and Aaron would agree with this, that in small private universities, they really love their alum, right? For a lot of reasons. It's small, for not just for giving, but for a lot of other things, because in small universities like that, you send your families and all of those. And so it opened up this door that for the next 3 or 4 years, we took groups of Milliken students, partnering with our church to do work in the Dominican Republic, which is awesome. So the kids ended up doing a 50-page business plan. They ended up, which was awesome, and the kids, the creativity, they found a way of taking internet to this village that hadn't been there before. The kids come up with all of this. And so first year we did the internet cafe. The second year we started sitting down with the people in the village and asking them, how can we help improve your village? Long story short, God used Crystal and I. She was on a trip, and Jacob, the last time we took like 25 Milliken students. They sat with us in devotions. We were able to speak. Can you imagine a church with at that time with a secular, really secular university? Ended up a young man from Skokie was hurting. His cousin had committed suicide. We go on the trip with him. We spent 6 months with him, mainly on our couch. You had to know Sammy. Sammy is very loud, Jewish boy, super great, ate all of our food and sat on our couch. And we were able to talk to him about Jesus for 6 months. To me, that's the providence of God, right? I looked and I go, I wasn't supposed to have been a Milliken, but a number of years God uses that. I look back and I go, so I was able to do that and able to reach into the lives of these Milliken students because of what God did way back when. And there was no supernatural miracles, but it was just the providence of God, right? It was just normal things that God used to bring about His supernatural well. And I love that. But if you looked at Ruth, it wasn't always good for her. The first chapter could have been suddenly and tragically widowed. The second chapter, the faith to leave Moab. Maybe the third, broken in Bethlehem. But God's always working. Here's the thing, and you've been there, right? We've had those chapters in our life that we go, I don't like this. I don't like where I'm at. There's pain, and this isn't where I want to be. But God isn't done yet. And see, that's the great thing about God, because of His grace and mercy and all of those things. And just because we make some bad mistakes doesn't mean that's the end of our story. It's just the chapter that we're in. So there's a lot of encouragement this morning. So we need to know, number one, that God is still writing your story, and we need the providence of God. We need to see those things that God uses that are natural. Then we step back over here and we look and we go, okay, so I'm here because of what He did there. First thing. Number two is strategic plans. Planning is actually spiritual. And this is one thing I'm not great at. I try to get better. But planning is actually a spiritual type of thing. And so Boaz, he just didn't go, okay, so I'm going to meet this guy. He has this plan to get Ruth back, all right, to make sure that he can be the kinsman redeemer. Look at verses 2 through 4. It says, Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town, and he said, sit here, and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here, in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. for no one has the right to do it except you, but I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. So again, there's this money deal coming along, and I'm assuming this guy that's a potential kinsman redeemer, I mean, he's like, this is probably a good deal. Getting some land at a good price, right? Those of you that are farmers, I mean, yeah, this sounds great. Verse 5. Then, this is where Boaz flips the switch. He throws this monkey wrench. He says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. I don't know, Ronnie, the deal just maybe not so good now. The dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. You see the plan? He wants to meet him. And then he says, hey, you know, Naomi, she's going to sell some land. Great, I'm going to do that. I'll do what I need to do. Oh, yeah, there's one catch. You got to take her with you. You got to take Ruth with you, the Moabite. And suddenly, and he tells him all these things, suddenly this is not as good of a deal. The land's going to go back into the family, so it's not even something that he really cares for. So we look back in verse 6. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I can't redeem it. I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I can't do it. Strategic plan, providence of God, right? Now the plan is working. This guy looks and he goes, okay, this isn't a great deal. In fact, this is going to cost me a lot, and it's going to cost my family. So, put the brakes on. Not a good idea. So Boaz is working his plan. If you remember early on, Elimelech, when he was in Jerusalem, there was a famine, right? And his plan was to take the family to Moab, which was where God said, don't go. That wasn't the plan. That wasn't a good plan. Ruth's husband, he didn't have a plan. So many people in the what we've talked about in the book of Ruth didn't have a plan. Boaz, who feared God, he had a plan. Listen to what Proverbs 21:5 says. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. God had a plan, right? Adam messes up in the garden, Adam and Eve, right? And sin enters in to all of humanity. And God just didn't go, oh, whoa. We got to sit back down and redo this. What did he do? He had a plan. He knew exactly what he was doing. He sent Jesus. Right? Because Jesus had to come because we were imperfect people and sin had filled the world. Jesus came to be our guardian redeemer and redeem us, right? He ended up coming and he walked here. He was a perfect Lamb of God. He died on a cross for our sins. So God had a strategic plan. So you got to see that both of them go together. And so I guess this morning, what is your plan? I mean, and again, it's a lot of different things. What's your plan financially, right? A lot of people just go, oh my gosh, I'm just now going to start do this, after not saving all my life. Or what's your plan for health? You haven't lived, a very healthy lifestyle all of your life, and now you're older. So, what are you doing to get to that point? It's planning. So Boaz worked this plan. Verses 7 through 10 says, now in early times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, this is great. One party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. Hey, maybe we should do that. We used to be able to do a handshake. That doesn't work anymore. You can't do business with a handshake. You have to have 20 attorneys to sign papers. But what if we just took our shoes off? I don't know. I mean, it worked then. For the property to become final, one took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Seems like a simpler time to me. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilon, and Mahlon. Verse 10, I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today, you're my witnesses. So again, providence of God, a plan, right? You got a plan. And then number 3, praying faithful prayers. Prayer is always the equation, right? It's always in the equation. Nothing ever happens first without prayer, right? I don't care how talented you are. I don't care everything you offer or what you're going to do, the best ideas you have. You you have to have prayer. And the question always is, how long do you pray? Well, if you've noticed in here, it wasn't a length of prayer, but there was ongoing conversation of prayer. So I don't know about you, but I am not good for long periods of time to pray. Maybe anybody here, you can sit for an hour and pray. And that's great. Maybe there's a few of you. That's not me. My mind wanders. But even in the book of Ruth, we're seeing this ongoing conversation of prayer. I wrote a few of them down. Naomi prays to Ruth, may the Lord give you a husband. Ruth prays, may the Lord deal with me if I leave you. Boaz prays, may the Lord be with you. And the elders pray a generous prayer of blessing to Ruth. And if you look in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So they're praying a prayer over her. The providence of God. That's huge. I mean, young people, I tell you, all of my life, I look at where I'm at, and I'm running 2 homeless shelters, and I've never got out of college. That wasn't a thought. Hey, I want to run 2 homeless shelters when I got out of college. Wouldn't have thought. But I went through a lot of chapters of misery to get where I'm at. Why? Because I don't think I could handle where I'm at, because this is not the easiest or, excuse my English, funnest job in the world. If I get it, if there's any English professors, that's not a real word, but I use it all the time anyway. But I've seen the providence of God in a lot of things I've gone through, good and bad. Sometimes the providence of God is found in bad things, right? You go through and you find out the reason you went through was because God had something over here. But when you're over here and you look back, and I think the older we get, the more we can do that. To me, it's also called wisdom. You look back and you find out where you're at is because of the providence of God and the things that God did. And it wasn't coincidence and it wasn't chance. It's God. Right? And then we plan well. And again, God planned everything. And so if you look at verse, I told you the amazing thing about Ruth's story is it connects to Jesus. See, this was a Moabite woman who was sinful, right? She lived in a land, they worshipped other gods. You know, she forsakes that God, makes the right decisions, forever changing not only the chapters of her life, because it wasn't easy, but her overall story. Because we read about her in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. I'm going to read that. I'm going to read verses 4 through 6, because Ruth is the direct lineage of Jesus Christ. That's amazing to me, right? So if they can do that, I'm going to read it first. It says, verse 4 says, Ram the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and in verse 6, Jesse was the father of King David. And we can go on and on and on until we get to Jesus. See, the story of Ruth is so many things, but what we have to remember was her story wasn't written when she was in Moab, a sinful woman, right? Her story wasn't done when she was struggling, the widow that lost her husband and was struggling and she was poor. Her story wasn't done when she didn't know, she thought she hit it off with Boaz and things were going well. It was just a comma. See, the only time there's a period at the end of your story is when you die. That story's done. So the encouragement for all of us, young people, older people, is that God's not done. I don't care if you're 12, 15, 85. He's not done with your story. And you might be in a period of time this morning where you're in a chapter and you're just like, I don't like it. It's hard. I want something different. Know that the providence of God is always working. In fact, put up the last slide. When you look backwards, you will see the providential will, power, and plan of a good God who is working all the time. When you look back, right? So the key is when you're going through something, all you want to do is look at what you're in. I know. Been in some bad things, right? You look at your life and all you can see is here. You can just see what you're going through. But when you look backwards, you see the providential willpower and plan of a good God who's working all the time. And He's working in those bad chapters. It's hard to see, right? Life is hard. Death comes early. I mean, all of those things. We understand that God's not done working. And then through all of those things, His providence is working to get us to the point where we are now. Maybe you're in a tough time. You don't know where God's calling. Think of it this way. You're going through some tough things. You don't know where God has you in 10 years. If you'd have told me when I was these guys' age that I'd be running